in a solidarity march as the attack and its aftermath continues to dominate international headlines. But thousands of miles away, another crisis went largely ignored. Boko Haram, insurgents in Nigeria, committed a massacre of unbelievable proportions in Borno State. Over a period of a few days, the terrorist group killed more than 2,000 people in the town of Baga, as well as 16 neighboring towns and villages, burning entire communities to the ground. Amnesty International described it as the terrorist group's deadliest massacre to date, and The Guardian reports that local defense groups said they gave up counting the bounties left lying on the streets. By every objective measure, Boko Haram's vicious massacre in Nigeria dwarfs the tragedy in France. So far that the Nigeria bloodshed has been described as one of the worst terrorist attacks in modern history. There's only one problem. In all likelihood, you probably didn't hear about it until just now. Where is the international outcry for these non-Western and predominantly Muslim victims of terrorism? The terrorist attacks in the Borno State and Paris unfolded over the same time frame, but the story of France generated more than 50 times more news stories worldwide. This silence is not accidental. There is a clear double standard when talking about Western versus non-Western and Muslim versus non-Muslim victims of terrorism. Terrorist attacks on the West and against non-Muslims in particular are sensationalized in the media, while those afflicting non-Westerners and Muslims are normalized and treated as business as usual, generating limited public interest and, in turn, limited outcry from activists and institutions that could actually affect change. This discrepancy in coverage raises important questions about the way the media talks about terrorism and whether Western news outlets that so fiercely dissected the brutal Charlie Hebdo massacre will ever see non-Western and Muslim victims of terrorism as mournable. And the result is telling. Reports about non-Western victims of terrorism are generally overlooked or ignored unless they fit a particular narrative of freedom and civilization under assault from Islamic extremism. Is the attention on Charlie really about the assault on free speech? Not necessarily. One day after the 10 white journalists were tragically murdered at the Charlie Hebdo and became martyrs for free speech, 2 Tunisian journalists, Sophine Sharabi and Nadir Qatari, were beheaded by Islamic State militants in Libya and received almost no coverage for their sacrifice. Additionally, the Committee to Protect Journalists found that more than half of the journalists killed in 2014 were Muslims, even though the international media dialogue the past year focused almost exclusively on the Islamic State's beheading of white American James Foley and Stephen Sotloff, as well as the deaths of other white journalists like Camille Lepage. More than half of the 61 journalists killed in 2014 were Muslims, many working in conflict-affected areas such as Iraq, Pakistan, Syria, and Somalia, writes Rafia Zakaria for Al Jazeera America. But few have received the recognition or commemoration accorded to Western journalists or a handful who work for the Western media outlets. If this were solely a question of who was fighting to defend free speech, then international media would be honoring the sacrifices of the scores more non-Western and Muslim journalists who have died in the line of duty. Most victims of terrorism are Muslim and non-Western, but we rarely pay as much attention. A conservative estimate by the Combating Terrorism Center at New York's Military Academy at West Point found that between 2006 and 2008, non-Westerners made up about 98% of al-Qaeda victims. A majority of those victims were Muslim. An additional report this past year for the Institute for Economics and Peace's Vision Humanity Project found that global deaths due to terrorism have spiked over the last decade. They were concentrated in Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Nigeria, and Syria, all non-Western countries with large Muslim populations. The report also explicitly linked the rise in terrorist activities in these countries to the U.S.-led war on terror, but the media continues to explicitly omit or gloss over these victims of terrorism unless their stories can be used to fuel Islamophobia. The media still offers an skewed depiction of Muslims. For example, the media narrative about the French attacks gave a short shrift to Ahmed Maharabe, the 42-year-old Algerian Muslim security guard for the Charlie Hebdo, who was also killed, and focused instead on the white journalists and editors who died. Moreover, the international media at times explicitly omitted Muslim identity of Malayan Muslim Lassana Batili, who saved customers during the siege of the Jewish kosher supermarket, while reiterating that terrorists were Islamicists. When other outlets focused on this distinction, they treated it as a shocking revelation. A Muslim wanted to save Jews. How novel. And this is stark contrast to the media narratives about Islam that do dominate international headlines. Western media fixated coverage last year on Malala Yousafzai, a young Muslim female activist from Pakistan who was shot by the Taliban on her way to school. Many media outlets used her story to advance a one-sided narrative about Islam, the oppression of women, and Pakistan more broadly, while glossing over her critiques of the U.S. drone program, which did not fit these narratives. So what does this have to do with Nigeria? Boko Haram made international headlines in 2014 for kidnapping 276 girls from a school in Chibok in the Borno state. Nigerian activists launched the Bring Back Our Girls hashtag campaign, demanding accountability from the Nigerian government. But after 2 weeks of little to no coverage, international journalists suddenly swept in and began to describe Boko Haram's as the Nigerians' Taliban, focusing the story on Islamic fundamentalist war, on the education of women, rather than the structural and bureaucratic shortcomings of the Nigerian government. The real story about Boko Haram and the Chibok girls could have not been furthered from the truth. Firstly, the girls, like Boko Haram militants, are Muslim, and all the Taliban and Boko Haram are both terrorist groups that invoke Islamist doctrine, or rhetoric, I should say. The history could not be more different than that of the Taliban. Moreover, Boko Haram regularly targets boys in attacks, but this was also left out of the story. Just as people are now standing in solidarity with the French and decrying the terrorist violence that tragically took 17 lives, we must all stand in solidarity with the Nigerians and decry Boko Haram's slaughter of 2,000 people. The lives of Muslims and non-Western victims of terrorism also matter, even if the mainstream media's omission of these stories may indicate otherwise. So here we have, why doesn't mainstream media want to talk about this? I mean, so after the French thing, then we go to the Golden Globes and football, and there's nothing else that's important anymore.
You know, but it's not only that. You know, there was the NAACP bombing.
What do you mean? When was this? What are you looking at?
If we go, there's an article in the daily.com.
Daily dot?
Yeah, daily
D-O-T?
Yeah, daily.com. Mm-hmm. The NAACP bombing proves how mainstream media is failing you. And this is, you know, I have to tell you that the information we share here, you're normally not going to get it in mainstream media. You got to dig really hard to get it. All right? On the morning of January the 7th, this is an article written
January 7, 2015?
Yes. By Brent. This article is by Ben Brandstetter. Uh-huh. This article is dated January the 8th, 2015.
Last week.
The NAACP bombing proves how mainstream media is failing you. And we also have some audio on that too as well.
Okay.
On the morning of January the 7th, news junkie like myself woke up to a plethora of shocking and tragic stories, be it the bombing of an NAACP office in Colorado or the massive terrorist attack which claimed 12 lives at the French satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo. The last of those understandably received the most coverage. The attack, likely carried out by Muslim fundamentalists angry at the newspaper for depiction of Muhammad, comes just a few weeks after an Iranian cleric held the Sydney cafe hostage amidst a storm of threats and call to action from ISIS. That said, one cannot imagine that an attempted bombing at an NAACP office did not even deserve a mention from most mainstream media outlet, cable news in particular. Employees of the advocacy group heard a loud explosion Tuesday morning walking outside of their office to find an ignited IED and a large canister of gas which, had it successfully exploded, could have made the attacks far worse. While the FBI have not ruled out whether the attempted bombing is a hate crime, they gathered from eyewitness reports that their lead suspect is a middle-aged, heavy-set white male. While the body count and international implication of the Paris attacks are far larger, making the incident inherently more newsworthy than the Colorado Springs bombing, which took no lives and inflicted minimal property damage. One of the many benefits of 24-hour news cycle is all major stories can get their due. Of course, it benefits few cable networks choose to take advantage of. MSNBC, supposedly the most progressive of the three major cable networks, spent the entirety of its morning coverage in Paris, not mentioning the Colorado Springs bombing once. What makes this disparity all the more shocking is the heavy coverage the Colorado Springs attack had attracted via social media. As the Daily Dot Patrick Howell O'Neill points out, which much of the chatter about Colorado Springs incident on Twitter expressed outrage at mainstream media outlet for largely ignoring the incident. In fact, the hashtag NAACP bombing held its own amid topics directly related to the Paris attacks, including hashtag Charlie Haydo and hashtag I am Charlie. Even Colorado Springs local was shocked to have learned about such a major incident from social media. I mean, there's more, but I'm not going to go on to read the rest. And it just shows you, it just tells you over and over and over how the news stories are distorted. The stories that you get, you just can depend on these outlets to get the story. Now here is another story. Is this why the bombing of the NAACP was not labeled as terrorism like the Paris shooting? Let's take a listen to this. Is this why the bombing of the NAACP was not labeled as terrorism like the Paris shootings? Let's see if we can get this up.
While you're pulling that, did you read the article about riots?
Terrorism. The FBI defines it as the unlawful use of force or violence against persons or property.
Audio
Don't
problem.
worry, this tends to happen with these type of audios. But you go ahead. We're gonna bring it back up.
Well, did you read the article about how after the Ohio State football game there was, I don't know if you call it a riot by the students who started burning and tearing up stuff, and no one has called them thugs or...
No, I didn't read that.
It's another situation, again, where the media gets to determine who's a thug and who isn't.
So that's the Ohio State.
Ohio State, they won, they're going to whatever that is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So at the Ohio State.
Let's see, Ohio. Well, and then I'll go back to the article that you were looking at there about the NAACP.
Yeah, I'm trying to bring this back up. This would be something good for us to bring this back up.
And it says, here's this. There's a nice paragraph in this article while you're pulling up the article. It says, despite the lack of coverage that is of the NAACP attack, shows that mainstream media is ready to move past the Black Lives Matter, and the movement that surrounds it. This is typical of the media's treatment of social awareness campaigns. Once the theatrics of tear gas and riot gear have evaporated, so too have the news cameras. This is why continuing protest in New York City has largely been replaced with the